Okay. It's
Alright.
rolling. It's rolling.
Hi, kids.
Hi, guys. It's me. You've met me. I'm here this afternoon with my friends Cliff and Pam, and we wanted to tell you some stories about life and the Cold War and their experiences, and I might interject here and there. But before we get started, can you introduce yourselves
Yep.
to the kids?
I'd be happy to. I'm Pam Gress. I was born in 1954, so my memories of the 50s are a little shaky. I grew up primarily as an Army brat. My father was a dentist in the Army and eventually acquired some very good rank. And we spent most of our time between North Carolina and Germany. And I had a wonderful life, but I grew from that experience to have an intense dislike of the military, which might not be very popular with many of you.
I was born in 54. I'm an immigrant son. My father was a German immigrant. He came over with his grandparents in 1921. My father grew up as a regular American boy, pretty much, even though he lived in a German household. When the war broke out, my dad volunteered to fight for the armed forces against his birth country. He at first was an aerial photographer, and then he spoke German. They transferred him to Army Intelligence, where he attained the rank of major, and he interrogated a lot of Germans in Berlin from 1945 to 48. He was there to find out whether they were truly Nazis or not. Whether he sent criminals to Nuremberg, I do not know that. But as far as the Cold War was concerned, the U.S. and allies were Russia. We defeated Germany, but there were many times my father was shot at by Russian troops while he was stationed in Berlin. General George Patton, a great military officer for the United States, expected the U.S. and the Soviets to go at it right after World War II. We all know about the Hiroshima bombings that sealed the deal and stopped the war in Japan. But at that time, the Cold War was certainly brewing, and blowing up 2 nuclear bombs was certainly a statement to the Soviet Union of the massive power that the United States had. And then it was a matter of escalation as both sides escalated.
So when you were growing up, like how were you taught to feel about communists or communism, like at home and in the community? Were you getting the same messages or different messages?
I had kind of a mixed experience. My mom was surprisingly neutral. There were a few things that tipped her towards anti-communism, but for the most part, I grew up in a very anti-communist world. Mm-hmm. My neighbors, the news media, my family, my friends, we had an expression that was very common in those days, better dead than red. Mm-hmm. McCarthyism was flourishing. But my mom, who was a little bit more even-tempered and more neutral in her views, saw McCarthyism for what it was and mm-hmm. saw that it was probably a bad result of the anti-communist feeling that was surrounding us.
That hysteria.
Yes, exactly.
Everybody worked up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
But we called them commies and reds all the time.
Mm-hmm. Well, even in like the early 80s, mid 80s, I heard better dead than red too.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And did you hear the word commie?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah.
And I'm curious if it's, and I don't remember, but I'm curious if it's because I've always been like a lover of history and I've always read like books about history, and so if I picked it up through that, or if it's just what I heard I'm not sure.
My father had
both,
a pretty intense hatred for Khrushchev.
Yeah.
And Fidel Castro was hated by both of my parents and most of my neighbors and friends. So yeah, that's what I remember.
Yeah. So what do you remember about the Cuban Missile Crisis? Because and how old were you? Because you would have been little.
We were 10 and 11.
Were we? I don't remember the
It
year.
was 62, 63. And we
okay.
heard a lot about it because Cuba was a scary area because the Soviets wanted to move missiles into Cuba. Cuba. This was, of course, a direct escalation because we had moved missiles into Western Europe already.
Well, in Turkey, we had missiles in Turkey.
We had missiles in Turkey. So they wanted to put missiles in, Cuba, which was 90 miles from the coast of Florida. Many Cuban nationals were sick and tired of the communist influence. And there was an event staged with the CIA and the FBI called the Bay of Pigs, where we sent Cuban nationals to try to attack and take Cuba. It failed miserably.
It was one of the first things that happened with under Kennedy's administration. Was the Bay of
it was
Pigs.
Kennedy's administration.
Yeah.
Yes,
Eisenhower started the CIA process of like, hey, you guys go train these Cuban exiles, but it was under Kennedy that they went in
and it failed miserably.
And I remember the fear. It was way too close for comfort. America's enjoyed the luxury of not having a ground war
Since the Civil War.
Yeah, forever, basically. And Europe hasn't been so lucky, and many other countries haven't been so lucky, but it was starting to look like we would see bombs, and we were getting extremely nervous and scared. It was a very tense time. I was not in the United States at the time. I lived in Germany during the whole thing. But I remember the tension on the Army post, the tension among my parents and their friends.
Did they talk to you about it as a kid?
No.
Kids just know.
Yeah. No, they didn't really.
It was funny. My grandfather served in World War I for the Kaiser. And he migrated over here in 21 after the war during the Weimar Republic when the inflation was going crazy. My father, born in 21, fought for this country against his homeland. I lost my point. Oh, yes.
Come back
but
to you.
my grandfather fought in
Story of my life right here. What was I talking about?
My grandfather fought in World War I. My father fought in World War II. And I assumed I would fight in World War III.
Right, yeah.
It was just like a common thing you would accept.
Yeah.
We played Army all the time. I don't know if kids play Army all the time. We had all the gear that our parents brought home for World War II. And then the Korean War broke out right away. And then right after that, Vietnam broke out right away. And then the huge protests started in this country. But getting back to the point where, like in 62, 63, where the crisis was really extreme, Khrushchev took off his shoe. He was the leader of the Russians, and he was pounding on the table saying, "We will bury you." And it was a huge threat. And both sides had enough nukes to blow each other up. We had nuclear drills in school where we actually hid under our wooden desks.
Duck and cover, duck and cover.
Was that the nice theme? And
I played the song for the kids last week.
Oh, really?
and
It's real.
you
Yeah,
wonder
it's
at
real.
10 years old, you're thinking, well, I just been told I could be blown to bits. And a 10-year-old kid wants to go home and play with his toys. But then again, something in the back of the mind said, geez, I'm ground zero. They're aiming the missiles at me. Of course, we were aiming them at them too. So, but some numbers. At the height of the Cold War, back in the early 60s, there were 6 or 7 nations and there were 70,000 nuclear weapons in the early 60s. Today, we've got it down to 12,700, but the U.S. and Russia own 90% of those Soviet missiles. I read an article that said Russia's just a gas station for the world. And I thought, well, that is naive when they have over 5,000 nuclear weapons.
Mm-hmm.
We have over 1,200 nuclear weapons ready to go right now. So we play the game too. And this escalation game has got to stop.
Mm-hmm.
So
if we could come back to
yeah,
talking about the Berlin Wall and just like, and being in Berlin, or being in Germany, and
I remember.
and Kennedy and the speech, like
Ich bin ein Berliner was the Kennedy
Yes.
speech. I am a Berliner too.
Yes.
I think it was 61, maybe 60. I'm not sure. It was before his assassination, of course.
I want to say 63, but don't hold me to that.
Yeah. But I remember listening to Armed Forces Radio on our family transistor, and listening to the whole speech. It was kind of cool. I was in Frankfurt at the time, and he was in Berlin, and a lot of my friends got to see him. They went to Berlin to see him. Now, there came a time when my father gained enough rank in the military where my mother and I and my brother, dependents of my father, were no longer allowed to travel to Russia or to Moscow. We couldn't visit at all. My mom...
Had you been there prior?
I'd never been.
Okay.
My mom went there, and she got some trinkets. This is a Star of Lenin pin with a picture of Lenin as a baby. And she got some other...
Okay, I thought it was Russian, but I didn't know who the baby was.
Yeah,
Okay.
it was Lenin.
Lenin baby.
And then some other little trinket pins that she brought home as souvenirs. So she got in and got a chance to see...
I'm going to take pictures with these.
She got a chance to see Moscow and visit.
But when you became an officer's daughter, you were not allowed to go in because
A hostage.
of fear of kidnapping.
Yeah. It was the Department of Defense didn't want a hostage situation, and
And
they would let non-commissioned officers dependents go,
but not.
Yeah.
That's a whole other story.
That's
about
another
social
story. Another
class
day,
and
another
ranking.
interview.
For sure.
But the wall, that was a huge...
Talk about when you and your mom went to visit the
I
wall.
will, but the wall was went up in 62 or 63, and it wasn't just dividing Berlin, which was an isolated spot within Eastern Germany. And that was all negotiated by Roosevelt and Trump and Stalin and Winston Churchill. So the wall wasn't just in Berlin. The wall extended like 120 kilometers, both north and south of the city, which kind of, stopped people from moving around. The wall was there to prevent East Germans from escaping to the West. That was the whole period, the deal. In 1966, my mother, who was a Berliner, took me there. And you could stand on the American side of the wall and look over and see what was East Berlin. There was a huge no man's land patrolled by Russian or East German soldiers with automatic weapons, with German shepherds, with barbed wire, with any barricade you can think of. And it was a long, difficult
Trench, basically.
where there was a lot of killing zones. All the buildings.
Well, they had the towers.
Oh, the towers. There were turrets, of
Yep.
course, turrets with machine guns. All the buildings on the eastern side of the wall, all the windows were cemented up. All the doorways were cemented up. It was like a giant wall. I don't know how many people escaped from East Germany to Berlin. They did it in various ways. Many were killed. So in 66, I got to stand on the Berlin Wall with my mother.
How old were you?
I was 14 or 15.
Okay.
And
So you were like these kids, you were like their age
Yes.
when
And I knew she was from Germany. I knew some of the horrors that she had seen in the war. And we stood on the wall. We looked across no man's land. We saw the horrible barricaded buildings. And my mother pointed and said, I used to live over there. They took my property. And the tears started. And it was such a poignant moment. I felt so sorry for her that her beautiful city was torn in half by the communists. She didn't live till 1989 to see the wall come down, which would have been a tremendous moment for her. She did live, though, to see the U.S. airlift to Berlin. And I don't know if your kids knew about that. West Berlin was isolated, surrounding not much food, and the Allies actually flew missions and dropped goods into Berlin to help the Western people. From that point on, my mother said, the Americans are the most giving people in the world. And that affected me deeply. Certainly that Berlin airlift affected my mom super deeply. She never went back. She passed away in 1973 in Germany. So she never saw the wall come down, which would have been quite an event for her. So,
have you guys been back since the wall came down?
not to Berlin, no.
Not
We've
to
been
Berlin.
back
We've
to
been
Germany.
back to Germany, but not to Berlin.
Yeah.
I've never been to Berlin.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What?
Really?
Never.
I'm very surprised by it.
I'm a
just
little
assumed.
surprised myself. Yeah, I don't have a strong connection there. I've been to a lot of different places in Germany, of course, but I don't have a lot of interest in Berlin.
Yeah.
To be honest with you.
Yeah.
The Germans kept a church, the Kaiser Wilhelm's Gedächtniskirche. I'm hoping I pronounced that right. It's a very old church.
We don't know if you didn't pronounce it
Okay.
right. So it's fine. It sounded
I did my best.
sounded
You
right.
have to pronounce every syllable in German or you do it wrong. But anyway, this church is a memorial to what the German people did in World War II. They left this memorial to stand in their modern rebuilt city. Berlin was smashed. They left this as a symbol of their war crimes that they committed in the 40s. And I give them a lot of credit for doing that. The Germans live with a lot of guilt for what they did. Newer generations have less guilt, but it's still in their history. It's illegal to say the word Nazi in Germany. They do as much as they can to not extinguish their history, but to demonstrate what they did, and they live with it.
I think that's really I don't remember the word you used, but I think that's admirable to like remember the mistakes as to not repeat them.
And
I
not,
think
and they're
so
not held
often-
up, and
Right.
Yeah.
And not also dwelling on them necessarily, but I think so often we like just as human nature, we don't want to talk about the bad things that we did. It's embarrassing. It's this, it's that, it's guilt. And I think as a country, sometimes we do that too much too. Like we don't want to remember the bad things, so let's just not talk about them. And
Yeah, America's shame and issue is slavery and the whole Confederacy, and we still haven't made our peace with that.
right. And I think that if we could do better making our peace with that, we would do better moving forward from that.
Yeah, I agree.
So
I agree.
And another thing, and I know it's only rock and roll, but I like it.
yeah.
It was a Stones song, and But really, Radio Free Europe was
Oh, yeah.
an institution that the Western world broadcast Western music to the Soviet people. This was a huge influence in changing the mind of the Soviet man. Um, you guys may know of a band called the Scorpions. They're a German band. They wrote a song called, what did I write?
Oh, it's
Winds of Change.
Yes. We're gonna listen to it.
They wrote this song because Moscow was opening up to the West and allowing bands to play. This song was really written because they could play on Moscow. But the song now really applies to the destruction of the Berlin Wall. And it's pretty effective song. So I hope she'll play that for you.
I will.
And then there's another song called Eva Destruction that came out in the early 60s, was all about fear, about nuclear bombs and stuff.
So you told me rock and roll helped bring down the wall. Can you elaborate on how rock and roll helped bring down the wall?
Well, I think rock and roll is a music for folks. And so when they keep playing the Stones or the Beatles or Lynyrd Skynyrd or whatever bands we played, Rush, ELO, Bob Dylan, that the people started to think that, oh, there's a different way of thinking than just kowtowing to our government. And they liked the individual thought that Americans broadcast to them, because we are individualist thinking as opposed to common for the group. And it was huge. And I'm sure Radio Free Europe broadcast political speeches other than just music, but
Radio Free Europe was huge. It was a huge impact. And it was much beloved by anybody who was behind the Iron Curtain at the time.
Because it was that was their glimpse beyond the Iron Curtain.
It was.
Yes.
Right? It was
Yep.
like the I don't want to make lifeline. I don't know if that's the right word, but
that would be a good word, a good way to put it. And it was a real thorn in the side of the Soviets because they couldn't suppress it.
I'm
You know,
surprised
ham
that
radioists and stuff just kept those airways going, and it was a big deal.
yeah, that's really cool.
Propaganda free. We're not sure that's completely true, but that's what it was viewed as at the time. And propaganda is a big game. We should know this now more than ever. And reliable news sources. In fact, I put some notes down about life in America in the 50s.
Yeah.
And Walter Cronkite was one of our 3 news anchors. And he was the most popular. And he would end every single broadcast. And that's the way it is. And I thought, what a pompous thing to say nowadays when we have an overload of information and disinformation and a variety of different sources. But we were naive, and we trusted him, and we trusted our news sources, and everybody kind of had the same source of information at the time.
I mean, there were 3.
3 networks.
Three.
Yeah.
That was it.
Yeah.
ABC, NBC, and CBS.
Yeah.
And you didn't have any options.
No.
And certainly, of course, no internet. So,
Oh yeah, and one other thing I wanted to say: my mother, growing up in Berlin, they didn't have a lot of stuff. She actually had to, nylons were popular back then with a seam in the back, and of course, all the nylon had to go to the Germans for their parachutes.
Yeah.
So women would paint a nylon seam on the back of their legs. Yes. They do what they'd have.
Yeah. And I'm just thinking, I'm so sweaty that if I had to hand draw that seam, it would have been bleeding down my leg.
it probably did for a lot of women.
I would have been so embarrassed.
My mother also, after the war, she, expected a third world war.
They always did.
I don't know why
everybody
this
did.
logic, but it was logic.
Well, our kids still talk. I mean,
World War III?
Yeah, like on Thursday when the kids came in, a lot of not all of them, but a lot of them were really worked up about Russia and
Oh,
Ukraine
right.
and worried. And they were like, is this another Cold War? Is this World War III? And I don't have an answer except we
No.
got to watch.
We have to wait and see.
Putin,
Yeah.
said, hey, let's get our nuclear defense arsenal guys all on alert.
Already, yeah.
Did you know that Putin was stationed in Dresden with the KGB when the wall came down and the Soviet Union was dismantled?
I knew he was part of the KGB or had ties to the KGB.
And
but
when he witnessed the wall coming down and the Soviet Union becoming dissolved, it was a personal crisis for him and extremely threatening, which speaks to and informs his current behavior, I think, a little
Absolutely.
bit. Yeah.
Yeah. he
Anyway,
wanted the
that's
Russian
on another
Empire.
topic
Yeah.
another day.
But one more thing about my mother, living with without a lot of stuff in Berlin. When she came to America,
the land of stuff.
she saved bacon grease. And we had jars of bacon grease in our freezer, and my dad would, throw one out, and she'd add another. And I go, Mom, what's all this bacon grease for? And for the next war.
And she
So-
would fold tinfoil.
So we were raised thinking,
Yeah.
I was almost drafted. I mean, I was drafted. I got A1 or 1A, whatever the designation was. I was in Germany at the time. And my friends on the stateside all had to come up for their physical, get on the line, feet on the line, and they were still civvies. And luckily that was the year they abolished the draft. I didn't have to make the decision of what I would do, but
So if you could, if you had any sage advice to give kids today about anything related to what we've talked about today,
yeah, I would say,
what would you say?
watch as many shows about the world as you can and see how many cultures there are. Realize the world is one world. If you call it the Atlantic Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, the Indian Ocean, maybe you should just call it the ocean. And we have the earth and the ocean. And personally, nationalism is an outmoded ideal which should be gotten rid of. All it does is cause war and taxes. We live in a global world now, and we better get our act together. So that's my last. And one other thing, just as a practical means, pay your mortgage before you retire.
Yep.
I've got T-minus 12 years.
Okay.
Get that paid off.
Well, my advice would be to echo that. I think we need to think more globally. I think we need to dial down nationalism. I love this country, and I think I might be one of its greatest patriots. But patriotism has its place, and it needs also to be dialed down. And I do not think fighting a war makes any sense in this day and age. I think what's happening now in the Ukraine and with Russia is outdated and embarrassing and a giant step backward for mankind. I think we're better than that, and I think that we should be reaching beyond that. If you have ambitions or ideas about becoming a soldier, I would like you to really think long and hard, because I think many people in Greenville particularly are naive about what that means. I would also encourage you to leave the country and do some traveling. I think the more global you can make yourself and the more traveling you can manage in your life, the better. It's just not available for a lot of us. But if you ever get 2 coins you can rub together and get a passport and go see something, I advise that you take advantage of that.
Yeah. I've learned so much more about myself by traveling
Oh,
too.
It's the best education.
And not just about the world, because of course, like I've learned a lot about the world too, but I've learned so much about myself.
Yeah,
It's
you re-see your home.
Yeah, it's it's amazing. So, you guys, I love you so much.
I love you too.
Thank you for
You're
having
wonderful.
us.
Well, thank you for letting me interview
Yep.
you.
You're
Well, I
welcome.
hope we didn't put them all to sleep. You might have to do
No.
some editing.
Hey, we're at 30 minutes. We're doing good.
Okay.